Oh, this is, oh, okay.
Do you see the
I think
notes?
the message is that we just started recording. So I'm going
Okay.
to start off this, Nicole, and my name is Ray Hill, and on behalf of Clement Schwartzinger, who's our Zoom host and technological whiz kid and expert cutter, and myself, we would like to welcome you all to join us for a most interesting evening or day, depending where you are in the world, and having a chance to look in a very privileged look in our second of a mini series on great gem collections in the museums of the world. The first, of course, having been the Museum of Natural History in London. And now we're privileged to have a chance to peek in behind the doors and the sacred vaults and so on of the Museum of Natural History in New York, which, by the way, is amongst the oldest museums in the United States.
Yes.
Um, and
1869.
well, we'll get to you in a second. So basically, I look upon museums as being one of the pillars of my personal education, and I hope yours as well. And it's a chance every once in a while when you can get away to to have an experience of wonder and amazement at the collections that the museums have managed to put together in some cases over the centuries, but definitely over the years. And since the museums generally belong to the people, in a sense, this is an introduction to another museum with the hope that having had a little taste of what you can see at the museum, you'd want to go and see it in person. Because I believe that museums are very important places for us, not only to do our research, but also to help us learn visually a little bit more about the world of gems because we don't always see the level and quality and history of gems one can find in a museum collection. Today, we're very privileged because Nicole Childs, who's the collection manager for the Museum of Natural History in New York, for our gems, minerals, meteorites, and petrology, will
Yep.
discuss the creation of this historic collection, along with, and I'm looking forward to that, along with the highlights from the recently reimagined Minion Hall of Gems and Minerals. So thank you, Nicole. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I'm looking forward to hearing and seeing what we're going to see right now.
All right. Thank you so much, Ray, for that kind introduction. As he said, my name is Nicole Childs. I am the collections manager for the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences here in New York City with the American Museum of Natural History. And I thank you guys all so much for taking the time out of your evenings and days to talk about some of my favorite specimens that we have in the collection, which is our gemstones and minerals. And we're starting off strong with our title slide with actually it's a clock face that has been carved from onyx. So this is a Steger clock face. This was a German company that in the 19th century was very known for its work with quartz and crystal to make very fine watches and clocks. And this is actually a rather sizable piece that I believe is on display that measures about a foot across. And you can just see the way that the cameo style carving really shows itself so strongly in the onyx, creating these very dynamic and high contrast silhouettes within the stone. So I hope that you will enjoy as we actually take a quick step back in time and take a look at where the collection used to be. So the American Museum of Natural History is one of the oldest museums in the United States. We began operations, I believe, in 1869, and we have had a gem and mineral collection for the vast majority of that time. However, when we really talk about where the core of our gem and mineral collection comes from, you start to see that pop up a little bit more in the 1890s. So this is a photo of the original Morgan Hall of Gems and Minerals that opened in 1922. This was a staple of the museum up until its closure in, I believe, 1974, 1972, when it was reimagined once again, and we'll get to that in a moment. But you can see the very classic style of museum casing that if you head to the Natural History Museum in London, you can still see examples of. Europe still has a lot of their museums displayed like this. But here in the United States, this is very much an old school variety of exhibit that a lot of museums have moved away from, ourselves included. So these are the two individuals that we really have to thank for the bulk of our collections, especially in the gems and minerals. To the left, we have J.P. Morgan, who is probably best known for when you have to go pay your credit card bill at the end of the month, Morgan and Chase. He was a banker in New York City in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And to the right, that is a photo of George Frederick Kunz, which was let's say Morgan's pet mineralogist, pet gemologist at the very least. The two of them wound up collaborating a great deal from the 1890s onward to establish one of the largest and most impressive arrays of minerals, gemstones, and meteorites, and they brought all of those specimens back to the museum. They wound up first interacting in the 1889 Paris Exposition. George Kunz was trying to make a name for himself as a mineralogist, and he had assembled a fine collection of American gemstones that he brought to the Paris exhibition. And his display was so notable that it actually won an award, and it caught the eye of J.P. Morgan. The next year, he wound up purchasing the entire gemstone collection and wound up putting it in the American Museum of Natural History, but continued to stay in contact with Kunz and coordinate with him to grow those gemstone collections further. Morgan would go on to send Kunz to a variety of places, whether it was around the museums of Europe, to the mountains in Russia, to way down south in South America. And as a result, Kunz would bring back new and odd finds, including a vast array of gemstones, and we'll get into some of the specifics of those adventures later in the presentation. So where these things wound up, they wound up on display here at the AM&H. So this is an example of one of the old gemstone displays. This one is showcasing a variety of quartz and amethyst crystals, both in the rough form and faceted. There are actually a couple of stones that you can see here that if you have a really sharp eye, you can actually still spot on display to this day. What I find really interesting about this collection is it's not just showcasing the cut gemstones and the cut amethyst, but also the methodology. If you take a look a little bit, I don't know if I have a pointer, I probably don't, but right in the top left, there's this kind of long pen-like looking object that's in there, and that is actually a faceting mount for an amethyst. We still have that back in the collection space to this day, and it helps teach the viewer that this is how gemstones wind up being cut and carved with such high precision. You can't just do this by taking any old stone and rubbing it against sandpaper. Cutting gemstones requires precision equipment, and it requires a very steady hand. So after the 1970s, the Morgan Hall of Gem and Minerals wound up changing into the Morgan Memorial Hall of Gems and Minerals. Yes, that can get very confusing from an archive point of view, but we do manage to keep these two separate because the Morgan Hall of Gems and Minerals was on the fourth floor and the Memorial Hall was on the first floor. And there was a reason for that major move, and we'll get to that a little bit later. This is probably the mineral hall that many of you are familiar with. This opened in 1976 and closed as recently as 2017. It was a very large space, and the current mineral hall still occupies that space, but now with a few add-ons. And you'll actually notice, if you kind of take a look at the displays here, that a lot of the ethos behind our gemstone displays does wind up carrying over and informing how we improve these displays in the Mignoni Hall of Gems and Minerals today. So where are we now? Well, we're here in the Mignoni Hall of Gems and Minerals, which opened in 2021. So this marks our, oh gosh, we're coming up on, I think, 4 years now, which is, the time is flying, but we're really thrilled with the way that this exhibit has turned out. We have really improved the lighting, we've really improved the space, and I just love the way that we've made the gemstones more accessible to a lot of viewers, not only with creating these dynamic displays where we have our cut stones arranged almost like disassembled jewelry, but we've also installed digital kiosks. So every single stage and every single exhibit, you can wind up going up to one of our touch screens, selecting the exhibit that you are currently viewing, and you can have the option to interact with the touch screen to select any of the specimens that are on display to learn a little bit more about them. Sometimes it's just basic information like the carat weight, but sometimes if you get really lucky or you spot something really, really cool, you'll actually get a little piece of history alongside of those specimens as well. And I'm also going to try to give you a few stories that maybe aren't even included in the mineral haul. So if you do manage to take a trip out here to New York to see these, you'll have just a little bit of extra trivia to showcase to your friends and family. What I also really like about the new hall is we have a space that's not just dedicated to the gemstones, but also to our lapidary art and our carvings. So one thing that the museum has really prided itself on is the extent of our Chinese carvings, especially carvings in jade. We'll go into a little bit as to why this is, but suffice to say that there is a long history of studying jade at the museum. We have had a lot of mineralogists who are specialists in jade, and they've built these collections around their research interests, and we just get to benefit from it in a lot of ways. One piece that really stands out here is the purple jade piece that is imaged on the left of the standing woman. And that is a piece of Burmese jade, or from Myanmar. That is the only location in the world where you can get purple jade, which means that that jade had to be transported all the way to China in order to be carved into the figure that you see today. Many of these carvings are dating to the Ming or the Qing dynasties, and they come from a specific collection called the William Boyd Thompson collection. One piece on this screen is a little bit different than the others, and that is the elephants that are on the picture on the right. These lapis elephants are not actually Chinese in origin. These are Fabergé, and they come from the Peck estate, which is another way that we wind up growing our collections is when an estate winds up bequeathing a number of pieces to the gem and mineral collections. Not only do we have our own specimens to showcase, we also have a temporary exhibit gallery where we can invite outside organizations and institutions to showcase some of the incredible things that they have on display. So right now, the Meister Gallery is currently hosting an exhibit called Cosmic Splendor. This is a variety of jewelry that has been assembled by the Van Cleef Company, which are very famous jewelers. Their work has been worn by all of the celebrities that you've seen making their way down the runway, and the detail and intricacy of their work really speaks for itself. This exhibit is going to be available until January 4th, and then we will be rotating it out and hopefully opening another exhibit either in February or March. I can't tell you what's going to replace it, but I can tell you that it is going to be very, very cool. So if you don't have a chance to get over to New York in order to see this gallery before it closes, I did pull 4 specimens that are currently on display, and I took a couple of quick photos so that you can take a closer look. For the Francophones in the crowd, I'm going to apologize. I've already translated all of the French names of these pieces into English because you do not want to hear me try to butcher the French pronunciations. But on the top left, we have the sunflower clip, which was completed in 2016. That center stone that is that bright red is a spessartine garnet, and it is surrounded by yellow sapphires and diamonds and more orange spessartine crystals that are set into a yellow and white gold. Immediately to its right, we have the osprey necklace, which is a series of white gold sapphires, all surrounding an Australian black opal with some diamond accents. And these pieces are all taking inspiration from astronomy. They're all taking inspiration from rockets and space exploration. So they're really playing with these flowing forms. They're really playing with luster, and they're playing with contrast of dark against light. This is really exemplified in the Mysterious Stars necklace, which is the photo that is on the bottom left. And that uses a specific technique called the mystery set technique that places a lot of tiny little sapphires and diamonds together in these tightly woven bars. So you get that much more robust silhouette to the overall necklace. There are hundreds of sapphires and diamonds that make up this piece, and I cannot really fully explain the dazzle and luster that you can see if you visit these specimens in person. My personal favorite out of all of these 4, though, has to be the Opal Nebula clip, which is the one on the bottom right. You again have that Australian black opal, which is going to produce all sorts of color flash with the reds and greens and blues, and it is surrounded by an absolute bevy of gemstones. We're talking emeralds, rubies, sapphires, spinels, tourmalines, tsavorite, diamonds, and it's just creating this cascade of color. This is the one piece that I currently have on the slide that is actually inspired by a specific astronomical feature. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the Porpoise galaxy, but it is a spiral galaxy that is actually trailing red dust off into the void of space. And this red dust isn't dust, it's actually newly born stars. So the jeweler was inspired by the creation of stars, that hot forge, and the way that that is a dynamic process, and attempted to capture it in this piece. And I think in a lot of ways he succeeded. So we also have gemstones and carvings hiding around in the rest of the hall. I thought that it would be appropriate to kind of circle back to jade a little bit, because one of the main things that I can say is that jade has a long history at the American Museum of Natural History. Our current curator emeritus, George Harlow, is a specialist in Guatemala jade who takes a look at these processes not just as objects of extreme beauty, but also as something that can tell us a little sliver of the Earth's history. Um, George Kunz, also was heavily involved in jade, and he wound up being a very key component in discovering the source of jade in what is now Poland, but was at the time Germany. In the 1890s, on another expedition for Morgan, Kunz was out in Germany, and he had heard about this Nephrite, which was the question of where jade is coming from in this region of Germany. There had been a long-standing debate amongst a lot of German scientists, including ideas of jade forming there as a result of frozen lightning. But in the end, folks wound up kind of simmering down to opinions that maybe these things were being dragged from glaciers or rivers or were coming from some source that was really far away. Kunz wasn't convinced. He thought that he could find it nearby, and he wound up going to a nearby farmer. He asked for permission to search his property because that farm had been the source for a number of jade fragments, and he had a feeling that there was something there. And he was correct. He wound up finding a 4,700-pound slab of jade in the country rock in situ. And because he was the one who found it, the landowner very kindly gave him the right of discovery, and Kunz wound up bringing that back to New York. If any of you have visited the earlier Gem and Mineral Hall and you remember that big giant jade slab, that is the slab of Polish jade that Kunz was responsible for recovering. In this particular photo, there's two carvings that I actually want to draw our attention to. One is this Ming water buffalo, also from the Thompson collection. And then there is this tremolite carving that is also from China. And tremolite sometimes is called a mutton fat jade. There are distinctions between different jade species, and these are important from a carving perspective because these will give you different hardnesses and they will give you different colors. So you might have a different approach if you're dealing with a nephrite versus a jadeite versus a tremolite in terms of how you're going to carve it and what you might expect that end result to look like. This piece is really spectacular because it showcases these two bird figurines called Feng Huang, which are a mythological bird that frequently appear as a motif in Chinese sculpture and art. These were mythical beings that were said to reign over the kingdom of birds. And I just find that the peonies and the flowers that they have carved around these birds have really created a very dynamic piece. So this is available to see in person. And even if some of our exhibitry isn't explicitly saying that it's about gemstones or carvings, there are still pieces of lapidary art that are on display. You just have to look a little bit closer. Speaking of looking a little bit closer, I think that one thing that's on everybody's mind right now is, of course, the security of our museums, especially after the break-in at the Louvre. And I wish I could say that that has never happened at the American Museum of Natural History, but unfortunately that would make me a liar. Back in 1964, a fellow by the name of Jack Murphy, also known as Murph the Surf, wound up scoping out the museum over the course of 10 days in late October. We're actually coming up on the 51st anniversary of the theft. And he and his compatriots wound up breaking into the museum in the dead of night. They waited for a rainy day to make sure that nobody was looking up as they were climbing into the windows on the fourth floor of the old Morgan Hall of Gems and Minerals. And they absconded with 24 stones in total. This was absolutely devastating for the museum because among those 24 stones included three of our most prized possessions, which are our star sapphires and rubies. So we have the Star of India, the Midnight Star, and the DeLong ruby. It was a very long and arduous process. The theft was discovered the next day because the thieves wound up lucking out and picked the one day that the alarm system had its battery not replaced. So the batteries were dead, and there was no alert to the museum security that these stones had been stolen. When they discovered it the next day, they eventually got a tip from a nearby hotel where Murph the Surf and his compatriots were partying it up and really spending their money a little bit too soon, a little bit too close by. When the cops arrested them, they did wind up recovering nine of the stones, including the Star of India and the Midnight Star. However, there was a long and arduous process to find that final piece of ruby, which was the DeLong ruby. It was almost a year later when the museum had to undergo intensive negotiations with an unknown party. Some rumors say it was a member of the underground, in order to try to ransom the DeLong ruby back into the museum collection. In the end, John MacArthur, who you might know through MacArthur Genius Grants, wound up financing $25,000 to get the stone back into the museum's collection. As Murph the Surf was fond saying, live a little, steal a lot. Unfortunately, that includes the 15-carat Eagle diamond, which is one of the only known diamonds from Wisconsin, a 17th century Russian emerald egg, and a 737-carat aquamarine, none of which were ever recovered. Unfortunately, in a lot of these cases, these stones wind up being recut and resold in ways that really disguise their origin and make it very difficult to track down. And even if you were to track it down, you are not going to find it in its original condition, unfortunately. Which makes it all the more fortunate that we did wind up discovering our star sapphires in their original condition. So the most prominent of these is the Star of India. So this is the biggest star sapphire that we know of. And I'm going to put that caveat in there because anytime somebody says that they have the biggest of something, there is always a bigger one hiding in some little corner of the world that you've just never realized. But as far as we know, this is the largest star sapphire. This unusual optical pattern that you see playing on the surface of the crystal is actually due to fine inclusions of rutile, which is a titanium oxide. So corundum is an aluminum oxide. It forms a perfect little hexagon when it forms its crystals. And the rutile needles wind up orienting themselves perfectly along the symmetry of that hexagon. So it sends the light, the points of light through the points of the hexagon. So if you were to take this star and connect the edges, you would wind up seeing that core shape of the crystal. You have to polish these just right in order to get the asterism to show, and this is a marvelous piece weighing in at a grand total of 563.35 carats, which is absolutely ginormous. We don't know a whole lot about the history of this piece. There's a lot of speculation. Basically, George Kunz wound up going over to Europe and he came back with this, and the only note that he made is that this specimen has a historical record of 300 years. What does that mean? We're not sure. In all likelihood, what wound up happening is that there was somebody from India, possibly somebody in nobility, who needed a little bit of extra cash and decided that this was going to be the best way to do that quickly and quietly. Of course, a lot of people who wind up selling these kinds of things don't necessarily want their name out there in the world because they might have more. And so this information was simply never recorded. Another notable star sapphire is the Midnight Star, which weighs in at 116 carats. Now, this one is definitely smaller, but it is no less significant, especially because of its color. Notice this really deep violet. This is very unusual for a ruby or a sapphire. You're normally going to get your blues, you're going to get your pinks, you're going to get your reds, but this deep violet is a very unusual color, and that is where it derives its name, the Midnight Star. And then the final one piece of our trifecta is the DeLong Star ruby. This was originally discovered in Myanmar in the 1930s, and it was donated to the museum in 1938 by George Bowen DeLong. This weighs in at about 100.32 carats, and just because it's the smallest does not mean it is the least significant. The ruby versions of these are actually very, very hard to come by, even compared to the sapphires. And as a result, everyone who I've ever shown this to, who is a true die-hard gem lover, spends a lot of time staring at this and maybe drooling at it a little bit as well. So what else do we have on display? We have a variety of jewelry, some pieces which were worn by New York City socialites throughout the early 1900s. So you're going to see a lot of Art Nouveau style, these flowing forms that have some inspiration in the organic that really wind up weaving metalwork in together with the jewelry. So on one hand, we have a brooch which is set with an amethyst and diamonds, and then on the left we have an opal brooch, and again you can just see that flash of color, absolutely dazzling. We also have some older pieces. These are all Bohemian pyrope pendants. So pyrope is a variety of garnet, and it really has this lovely, deep, almost blood red color. Bohemia today would be the Czech Republic, so kind of your Central Europe, not too far away from Switzerland or Germany. And the one piece that I actually really like, I did not manage to get a good photo of, are actually the earring set that goes along with this. And what I really like about the earring set is that there's actually a little gold clasp that goes over the pendant of the earring. These are called coach clasps. So they, if you were a noble woman and you were traveling from point A to point B in your carriage, you were always probably a little scared of being stopped on the road and having everything robbed. So, in order to disguise how valuable your earrings were, you would wear these little clasps over top of the stone so that it wouldn't necessarily sparkle or shine. Now, personally, if I'm a highway robber and I stop somebody and start taking their stuff, and I see a big hunk of gold lacework hanging from your ear, I'm probably going to take that too. But it gave them a sense of security, and it was in fashion for a good portion of the 1800s. Other historic samples that we have include some excellent emeralds. I only have a small selection of our emeralds pictured here, but these are not insignificant ones. So the natural emerald that you can see on the left is called the Patricia Emerald. It was found in the Chivor mine in Colombia, and it was named for the mine owner's daughter. This is a 126 grams crystal. So that is not cut, not faceted. That is the actual natural form as it would have grown underground. And the fact that it is still in its natural form is quite astonishing, because usually when you get a gem of that size, of that color, of that quality, it is destined for somebody to turn it into a piece of jewelry. But somebody had the forethought to save this piece and to make sure that it wound up in a museum before it was cut. This piece was first discovered in 1920, and just to give you an idea, in 1921 it sold for $60,000. I'm not great with inflation math, but I can tell you that that price has probably gone up significantly. To the right, we have the Shetler Emerald. Now, this is an interesting tale of how stones can sometimes change as they change hands. So this again would have been a Colombian emerald. But this probably was collected at some point during the colonial period when Spain was first making its way through Colombia and into the mountains that were producing these beautiful stones. And Spain went through several periods of economic downturn after the colonial period collapsed and the empire started to collapse. And as a result, a lot of these Spanish nobles needed to get a quick buck, and they had all of these lovely green stones lying around. So what likely happened was a Spanish noble sold this piece to another wealthy individual, this time in the Mughal Empire in India. And once the emerald reached India, that is where it was actually carved. So this is a Colombian stone that was brought to Europe by the Spanish and then sent to India, and there it was carved. And now it was brought back to New York City, and it is now back in the New World and on display for everyone to see. The Shetler Emerald is 87.62 carats, so that is a very sizable crisp hunk of emerald, and it measures about 3.5 centimeters across. We also have some weird things that are just popping around that, again, you wouldn't necessarily realize what they are until you wind up poking through our kiosk and learning a little bit more. You would not think that this would be anything other than a pendant or some very elaborate uh, piece of jewelry, but this is in fact the bottom of an umbrella. So this is a massive aquamarine crystal that has been set into the base of an umbrella. And when I first saw it, I actually thought it was a doorknob. But after digging around, it turns out that this was a very kind of fancy use that was part of a socialite's kind of way of standing out in the crowd. I don't have a locality on this, and that is unfortunately a very common issue with gemstones. Uh, while we tend to be able to trace the location and the provenance of our minerals fairly easily, there was a long history of not tracking that information for cut gemstones, and that does still cause us a little bit of a headache from a historical lens today. But we do know a little bit of history. So these two gemstones are actually tied to this lovely woman who is Jane Norton Grew. She is J.P. Morgan's wife. And these two stones were actually donated to the museum in her memory. The first one up top is a really interesting pinwheel amethyst. So there is an odd zoning where you have an increase in that purple saturation only along certain faces of the quartz crystal. And the gemstone cutter realized this and was able to shape the stone to really center that zoning to create this pinwheel effect. The specimen on the bottom doesn't necessarily look like much, but it's very interesting from a historical perspective. This actually was personally collected by George Kunz while he was operating up in Maine and faceted and then given to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan then gave it to the AMNH. So there were a number of personal touches that wound up going into this piece. Speaking of George Kunz, he had a few adventures, especially in Russia, and these amethysts that I have pictured on screen were the result of his adventures. So he was led through the Ural Mountains by a colleague of his from a museum in Moscow. And he had been told that this particular town was really known for its amethyst crystals. The just really deep, great purple, high luster with excellent clarity. And there was this one woman that he had been told was an excellent source for these stones. Ujikova was a Russian peasant who had initially sold some of these stones to Tsar Nicholas II, but she wasn't super happy with how that trade wound up working out, and so she was reluctant to part with the rest of her stones to the Tsar. So when Kunz came into town, she decided to offer them to him. And Kunz was absolutely blown away with what he saw. He said, I had seen many beautiful amethysts in my day, but when these gems were dragged from beneath a mattress, were poured out before me from the depths of an old stocking, I gasped. Not one, but a dozen perfect gems of a color found nowhere else in the world, none less than an inch in diameter, lay sparkling on the rough table before me in a little elbow of light from the low window. And Kunz definitely had a way with words. If you've read any of his books, you will definitely know that he tends to wax poetic and sometimes exaggerate a little bit. However, I can tell you that these amethysts are of an excellent, excellent color, just the deepest saturation that you can hope to achieve. Now, part of the reason why Ujikova was not happy was because when the Czar gave her her reward for giving him such lovely amethysts, instead of giving her the title and the money that she hoped that she would get, he gave her this, which is a brass samovar. This is basically just a method of heating up your water and washing your hands. And I did a little bit of shopping and I found one that actually dates from approximately the same time period. And for a very low, low price of $225, you too can own a brass samovar of the same quality that this poor woman was probably given in exchange for some of the top amethysts that she's ever found. So that's most of what's happening in the front of house. And I have to admit, I had to skim over some of the things that we have on display because there are simply too many objects. If I wound up going into the neat little history of every little piece, we would probably be here all day. But I do want to take some time to take us further behind the scenes into the collections area. So The collection space houses the vast majority of our material. While most of our gemstones are on display, we have about 103,000 mineral specimens all said and done. Now, that's minerals, so that's not necessarily gemstones. Of our gemstones, we have counted about 4,803. We have 505 carvings and 296 pieces of jewelry. So, compared to the overall size of the collection, it is a rather small portion, but when you consider the quality and the variety that we have within our care, it's really actually quite impressive. And a huge amount of this is still owed to George Kunz and JP Morgan. We really haven't had an explosion of gemstones being added to the collection in the same way since those two wound up pioneering the collection back in the early 1900s. So again, Kunz winds up coming up like a bad habit. Here he is next to a series of tourmalines that he probably had a hand in finding. Tourmaline is a lovely gemstone, not so fun geochemically. I've heard people describe it as an alchemist's prescription of chemicals. It is absolutely a trash can of mineralogy. If you can stick an ion into that crystal lattice, it will stay there, which is really good for us because it results in an absolute tremendous array of color. So we'll get pinks, blues, greens, teals, even some blacks and yellows, and the zoning can be incredible even in the length of a single crystal. Kunz was majorly responsible for bringing tourmaline to the market, especially as a gemstone. He made his name bringing Northeast tourmalines to Tiffany and Co., where they would turn them into lovely pieces of jewelry that would be sold both to local New Yorkers and also abroad to fine connoisseurs of jewelry around the world. Um, the tourmalines from Maine were primarily green, but he also wound up finding a number of these gemstones in Connecticut, of all places. So, pictured here is the Haddam Neck, Connecticut tourmalines, all lovingly put into individually carved slots inside of velvet. And this was how they were presented to JP Morgan. And JP Morgan kept those in the original housing when they were then later donated to the museum. Whoop, there we go. I mentioned earlier as well that we have a fine assortment of Fabergé carvings. So these are all behind the scenes. None of these are currently on display. These are all part of the Clara Peck estate. And we have a variety of different sources for getting these kinds of carvings, but we are pretty sure that these are Fabergé. The feet of all of the chickens and the quail are gold. The eyes of every single one of these animals is diamond. The birds are carved from chalcedony, the rabbit is carved from jade, and the buffalo in the top right is carved from a variety of quartz called citrine, which has a nice pale yellow color. The detail work in these carvings is incredible, sometimes down to the feather. And it's not just precious gems that wound up being subject to these carvings. We also have a number of pieces of coral that Fabergé fashioned into a set of suckling pigs. It's very difficult for me to capture the detail work in the photos that I have on hand. And we do attempt to put these out on display from time to time at local gem shows. So Denver Gem and Mineral Show, Tucson Gem and Mineral Show. We will consider objects like these that might be hiding in the collections to make sure that the public has a chance to see these, even if only for a short period of time. We also have some weird things hiding in the collections as well, things that you would not necessarily consider a gemstone per se, and probably not wearable. On the left, we actually have carved halite. Halite as in table salt. The halite was originally sourced from Poland and carved into the shape of the logo for the Columbia University School of Mines. The Columbia School of Mines wound up having a very close relationship with the AMNH over the years, and in the 1980s, we actually acquired Columbia University's geology collection. And this is mostly being used for research purposes, but you do get a couple of weird things like this. I guess I don't know if necklace would be quite the right term because I imagine the sweat would be enough to potentially damage the beads of this particular string. But it's definitely an oddity, not something we can easily put on display, but I can show it to you here today. We also have in the realm of oddities this sulfur cast lion. So sulfur is not usually the medium of choice when it comes to sculpture. It's also its own kind of conservation nightmare because sulfur has a lovely tendency to off-gas and not just wreck itself, but wreck its neighbors as well. But this one is holding up rather well. It was cast into a lion by the Texas Gulf Sulfur Company sometime, I believe, in the 1930s. And again, these are these kinds of odd lapidary objects that you just don't necessarily expect to see. So in terms of our collection, I'm going to kind of just start showing off some of my favorite things from behind the scenes. We wound up really getting lost in the opals, which is understandable because we have 330 pieces of opal in our lapidary collections. We also have 803 specimens of quartz that have been either faceted or carved in some way. So if you're doing your napkin math, that means we have 1,133 specimens of silica that are basically making up the bulk of our gemstone collection. Our second place species for the most common thing that we have is actually corundum, so your rubies and your sapphires. We have 388 faceted or carved corundum pieces within our collection. So here are a couple of my favorite opals that we got to play with recently. The video is showcasing a very unusual opal called Virgin Valley opal out of Nevada. Now, Virgin Valley is known for its petrified wood. So there used to be a forest. Some volcanic event wound up coming in, burying that forest in ash. And as the rain kind of turns all of that ash into goop, it leaches out these elements like silica that wind up getting into the wood and replacing it. Now, normally you get something that's more like an agate, like you see with the Petrified National Forest or Petrified National Park in Arizona, with big red swirls, and it's very, very hard. But every now and again, you can get it to opalize instead, and that is what's happened here. So in the video, that beautiful knob of green and blue and red is actually the cast of a tree limb. And you can see it much more clearly in the middle photo, where it still retains a lot of the structure of that tree, where it almost looks like a tree ring that you've just carved through. Not a tree, but definitely an opal. I am holding a massive boulder opal from Australia. I had to beg them to take that photo a little bit faster. My hands were not very happy trying to keep that weight in line. But that is a opal that has come in through a crack in the existing rock and filled in that seam. Now, Australia also sometimes gets some fossil replacements of opal. You'll see clams and the shells of cephalopods, as well as occasionally even dinosaur bones that have been fully replaced by opal. I think that that's very, very cool, and opal's kind of a favorite of mine, if I'm going to be honest. The opal bias continues, this time with a Brazilian opal on the left. Now, locality-wise, this is not a usual place that you're going to find a high-quality opal. And what I can't really show in that video is how translucent that stone is. When I actually put it down on top of its label, you could read the text through the stone. And that translucency really adds depth to the flash. So those bits of green and blue and red are just dancing below the surface as if just out of reach. On the right, there's another opal that I just thought that was quite neat, not necessarily because the stone itself is anything special, but somebody decided to install a hinge onto it so that you could really appreciate that little secret surprise of opening up the geode and experiencing what that burst of color looks like, even though the stone from the outside doesn't necessarily look like much. Another neat piece, this is not your common gemstone, this is a cordiorite, and you can see it has this really lovely electric blue. Unfortunately, the internal fracture on this is pretty high, so it does wind up muddying the carving when you put light through from the back. This is why stone selection is so important from a lapidary artist point of view. You want to have as great a clarity as possible, so the cuts and the facets that you make really stand out to their full extent. But cordiorite is not a typical gemstone. This is more of a kind of a rock former mineral, but occasionally you do get good gem quality material. We also have a tourmaline. This one is from Brazil, and you can see a little bit of a cat eye effect. But what I really like to showcase here is, again, the color zonation. Tourmaline has this incredible capacity for color with really sudden and stark transitions, and the artist did a very lovely job with this cabochon, making sure that that zonation was preserved in the final product. Some other favorites of mine include topaz. So I have a Russian topaz here on the left-hand side, which is that beautiful blue. So blue topaz, often when you see it on the market, so if you go to your local jeweler and you're getting a blue topaz necklace, has usually been treated with a little bit of radiation in order to enhance that blue color. Natural blue topaz forms as a result of the ambient radioactivity in whatever rock that is originally hosted in. And there's not a whole lot of places in the world that actually produce natural blue topaz. Russia was probably one of the best known localities for it for a number of years, especially in the 18th and 19th century. But there have also been a number of significant topaz finds, blue topaz finds based out of Brazil, and some small blue topaz finds, relatively speaking, out of Colorado as well. And I just really love the play of light again with the faceted egg topaz that I have on the right here. I thought that a video was really the best way to showcase this. You can see how the facets distort my fingers, but there's not really a whole lot interfering with your view through the stone. The play of light on this is just marvelous. Some other favorites back to tourmaline. The one on the left is a main tourmaline. So this is the same material that George Kunz built his name off of. You have that beautiful green overgrowth with a pinacoid termination. And at the base, you can see the hints of the raspberry core that is inside. So if you were to slice this kind of perpendicular to that nice vertical crystal, you would wind up getting a cross section that was a green rind on the outside and a bright pink core in the center. And that is something that is often referred to as watermelon tourmaline. And I thought that the composition of the tourmaline on the right with the sidecar crystal doubly terminated right at the top of another sizable elbaite crystal was just too cute to ignore. That is from Minas Gerais in Brazil, possibly from the Cruzeiro mine. And again, you can see a little bit of that zonation where it has that pink tip, where it goes a little bit colorless and then more of a green teal towards the core. And some of my last ones that I'm going to showcase to you guys today before I can open the floor for questions are these two wonderful pieces here. Both are examples of things that you just do not see on the lapidary stage today. The item on the left is a variscite. So that is a phosphate nodule that forms in these big concretions out in Utah. This was a locality that was discovered and popularized by a famous American mineralogist by the name of Arthur Montgomery in the 1930s. However, this is a locality that has essentially been completely mined out. So if you were going to go to the variscite claims in Utah today, your likelihood of finding something like this is extremely, extremely low, if not just flat out impossible. Unfortunately, a lot of these nodules, I say unfortunately, a lot of these nodules have already been hit by lapidary artists and carved into cabochons. I've worn one as a bolo tie once. So it's actually very unusual to see these nodules still intact like you do with this specimen here. Speaking of unusual to see intact, to the right is something called a hiddenite specimen. And as the name might imply, it is not a very common mineral that you're going to come across. It is a chromium-rich variety of spodumene that is exclusively found in Hidden, North Carolina. And this material is absolutely rare. It's the same chemistry as a kunzite, which is also a pink variety of spodumene, but these deep, deep greens are unique to Hidden, North Carolina. And to be quite honest, this is the only piece I have ever seen on Matrix. So normally these crystals wind up popping off their host rock very easily. So if you do see them out and about and they're not cut, then they're probably just these little sticks of green. But this one is still on its original host rock, which from a geologist's point of view tells me a whole lot more information about how this grew, the environment that allowed for this kind of odd enrichment in trace elements to give this really green color. And again, you just don't see these. So this is a really unusual piece and is honestly one of my favorite pieces in the collection, full stop. And with that, I would like to thank you all so much for your time and for your attention. I'm just going to leave you with that last photo of the Gem and Mineral Hall. That is, in fact, a single crystal of topaz showcased there. It weighs about 575 pounds and was brought out of the Brazilian jungle by Alan Kaplan back in the 1970s and then brought to the museum. So that is not only on display, but you can even go up and touch it and give it a little pat. It's a monstrous crystal, and again, probably one of the largest topaz crystals that we know of in existence. So once again, thank you all so much for your time and attention. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And thank you again, Ray, for having me.
Well, after our brief conversation in the Denver show, I was really excited about the possibility of seeing and hearing what we just saw and heard. So thank you for putting it together. I mean, that was a very well done presentation. And as a Toastmaster, I can tell you that you are a good speaker. Not
Thank you.
everybody working in the system is that. Well, I had a question for you though. That purple jade lady, did it
Yes.
formerly occupy space in the Lizardro?
I don't believe so. I would have to double check the provenance on that. However, I am pretty sure that that was also on display in the Morgan Memorial Hall throughout for a long time. I think we've had that piece for a minute. I can check our database and get back to you though.
Oh, no worries. It just I do remember a special issue of the Lapidary Journal where they featured the Lizardro collection and they had something like that on the front page. So I thought, oh, that looked
I
really
mean, it's a
familiar.
very unusual piece because the purple jadeite really only comes from that one spot in Myanmar. So it's not a common material. It's not something that is commonly carved. So there are very few pieces that showcase that color.
True enough. Now, I'd like hope that somebody else here is going to ask a question because this was a very interesting presentation, very densely packed with information too. So
Yeah, sorry if there was a little overwhelm on that, but I was
no,
having a
no,
hard
not
time
at
picking
all.
and choosing, to be quite honest. There's still plenty of secrets hiding in the museum.
So I think you very successfully gave us a teaser, and that's what I was hoping for, not only to get some education, but also to excite people about going to museums. And that was the whole reason for this subsection in our programming, was to try and give people a sneak peek at some of the best museums around and encourage them to go there. And I heard during your presentation that you do make some of the collection available for research.
Yes, we do. If you have a research topic, you are free to email, you would email myself and the curator of mineralogy, Kate Kaseva. We take a look at proposals. We can tell you whether or not we have material that is suitable for your research, and then we can possibly arrange for loans after review.
Yeah, so thank you for doing that. Now I've been in the museum, but I was at a time when there was a problem with lighting, which you seem to
It's
have
better now.
very aptly solved because all the lighting looked amazing.
Yes, they did a lot of really careful work trying to color correct the lighting so that the specimens are showcased as naturally as possible. And on top of that, we've really opened the space up. I don't know if you remember the old hall, you remember that it kind of felt like a cave that was carpeted from wall to wall, and now it feels a lot sleeker. It feels a lot more open, and there's more breathing space not only for the visitor but for the specimens as well.
Yeah, because crowded displays sometimes distract.
Yes, very easily.
And of course, that brought up one of the subjects that I was interested in, which you just mentioned, was you color corrected the lighting, because certain experts from the Orient have been talking recently and have been talking for a while about color is actually a byproduct of lighting, and so you may see in the field a stone that looks amazing, and then you get home and it doesn't look as amazing or it looks different.
I mean,
And a lot of people do.
I always advocate that when you go to shows and you're trying to shop for specimens to bring
Mhm.
your own flashlight so that you know exactly what light you're looking at.
And you don't need, there you go, George. Hey, George.
Hey,
Hi, George.
yeah, a question. What fraction of your collection is currently available photographed online for people to see it?
That is the current problem. So unfortunately, we have a very small selection that's available online. We do have a digital resource through our archives, through our library that allows for a little bit of perusal of this collection. However, our actual database, the collections database, does not have a publicly searchable component. This is something that we're trying to work on fixing in the near future. And by near future, I mean like 5 years, if I'm lucky.
Okay,
But
thank
if
you.
you have any questions about anything in particular that you're looking for, please feel free to shoot me a message or an email. I'm happy to take a look and see on your behalf.
Can I ask this question? Sorry.
Sure.
Uh, this large piece of topaz, which is in your last slide, will it lose
Yes.
its amber color sitting out in the hall like that under the natural light?
So for the most part, when you're worried about color loss, you're going to be worried about UV light, specifically sunlight.
Mhm.
Most of the lights that are currently affixed in the hall are an LED, which are far less damaging to color. Also, certain topazes will hold on to their color better than others. So if you're dealing with something, say like a Topaz Hill, Utah topaz, absolutely, you leave that out in the sun and you're going to have that beautiful champagne color turn absolutely colorless within a very frighteningly short period of time. However, this is a Brazilian piece. Its color is much more firmly fixed, and we're not exposing it to sunlight, we're exposing it to an LED.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
That was a very good and relevant question because a lot of the Pakistani topazes as well have this problem of fading.
Yes, and there are plenty of specimens that do have serious issues even with the normal case lighting. Any of our silver sulfur salts are going to wind up feeling negative impacts from any amount of lighting. Orpiment and realgar also do experience a significant amount of decay due to overexposure to light. I don't want to say that we have sacrifice specimens that we choose for the sake of display, but sometimes we just have to make tough decisions in order to make sure that there are still things that are accessible for the public.
If we could take a look at the chat, have you access to the chat there, Nicole?
Let me see. I can
There
probably.
might be some questions in amongst that you could answer because not everybody in our audience likes to speak out.
Yes, no, I can relate. I might have to stop sharing my screen. Oh wait, no, there's chat. Okay. Anne Fraser looks. Nicole's sound is echoing. Yes. Let's see. Do you have any emerald from ancient Egypt in the collection? Actually, I think we might have one Egyptian emerald in our collection, believe it or not. I would have to double check. Yes, let's see. The lighting is, yes, I do agree that the lighting is very difficult at the Natural History Museum of London. I was actually just there earlier this month and I did bring my own flashlight. Actually, let me take that back. I borrowed a flashlight from one of my friends and that vastly improved the experience. So I can continue to advocate for bringing your own light source even when you're going to a museum. But I don't see any other questions hanging out in the chat, but I'm again, even if there's questions that come in afterwards, I'm very happy to answer things over email. So please feel free. Can I ask what is on your wish list? Oh, that's a great question, Pam. We are actually actively trying to grow our gem collections. I actually just realized recently that we lack a trapezium emerald, which I think is a grievous oversight that we need to find a way to fix at some point. Um, we have a number of gemstones that we've been shown recently. We just need to figure out the means of financing the acquisition. An email address here, I will write that quickly in chat. So um, if you would like to reach out, please feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions after this presentation.
Actually, if we can chat for a few minutes after the end of the program, Nicole, I had something I want to talk about.
Sure.
Yeah. So we had a good attendance. We had over 50 people, which for this programming is a fairly good attendance. The largest we've ever had is 75. So you did very well, I think. And I'm hoping that in people having a chance to go back and look at this film when it's in storage and available, that people will again have a chance to hear at at their own leisure the information that you shared with us today. I think I have to say that I think the museum is very lucky to have you doing what you're doing
Thank you.
because you have what sounds like an encyclopedic knowledge of things that you are in charge of. And I think that's and you appear to love your work, which is so
I try.
important.
If I don't enjoy it, I don't stick around. That's all I can say.
Yeah, so I think that peppered the whole presentation with your enthusiasm, and I thank you so much for that. If there aren't any other questions, I want to thank everybody for attending and sharing with us. We will have only one more program this year in November, and I will let you know about that as soon as I have it tied down. And we don't normally broadcast during December because it unfortunately tends to happen right in the middle of the Christmas season. And I don't want to do that to anybody, let alone a speaker or the people that are helping us do the Zoom. So that said, I would like very much to encourage you to attend again and tell your friends to attend our November meeting because not everyone's going to be as exciting as this one, but I'm sure it will be of interest and of powerful educational value. So thanks so much for attending. And if I can talk to you on Messenger in a minute or so, or if you can call me, Nicole, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure, we'll figure out the logistics. I might just email you and we'll figure out the logistics from there. I think that probably
Okay,
makes
that's
the most
perfect.
sense.
No, and thanks for your time and your energy and your
Of course.
incredible informational knowledge. And I'm really glad we had a chance to have a good peek at your museum. So
I'm glad that I was able to pull back the curtain a little bit. So thank you again,
you
everybody,
certainly
for your
did. That was
attention.
actually very cool. Very cool. Okay, well, have a great day, everyone. We're going to leave the meeting now, and we're asked the recording, whoever's doing the recording, to make sure this is archived so we don't lose this one. And I appreciate your efforts in helping us have the program. Thank you, Clemens, for what you were able to do. Thank you, Nicole, for your contributions. And we also like to thank your museum for allowing this to happen.
Of course. No, it was our pleasure.